While global leaders are gathering in Rome in Italy for the climate-focused G20 summit, all eyes will be on the upcoming COP26 climate summit in Glasgow in the United Kingdom. Climate pledges and climate jargon is still making headlines, but will global leaders deliver a strong climate mandate, which may indeed save our planet? Welcome to WION World is One. My name is Priyanka Sharma, and on this special broadcast of the WION VOA co-production, we'll take a look at some of the expectations from the summit. Now, Prime Minister Narendra Modi will be attending this weekend's international climate negotiations that will take place in Glasgow in Scotland. It's the first time that he's attending this since the Paris Climate Accord of 2015. The meeting promises to have an impact on the conversation around developing economies and reducing carbon emissions. Voice of America brings us more details in this next report. Take a look.
For joining us today for the launch.
On the eve of COP26 in Glasgow, dire predictions from the head of the United Nations. The world, says Antonio Guterres, is falling behind on reducing global carbon emissions.
The clock is ticking. The emissions gap is the result of a leadership gap, but leaders can still make this a turning point to a greener future instead of a tipping point to climate catastrophe.
But key global leaders are not even attending the meetings in person. Out of the world's 4 largest current emitting nations, only 2 will send a head of state, the United States and India. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan.
I would point out that neither China nor Russia will be attending the summit in person at the leader level, largely, it seems, due to COVID-19. The U.S. and Europe will be there, and they'll be there energized and united.
That leaves Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi to advocate the position of developing countries like India, Russia, and China. All 3 are reticent to phase out coal and have yet to commit to achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050, considered a key goal in limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. India relies on coal to produce more than 70% of its electricity. Nalima Jain is a senior fellow and deputy director in U.S.-India policy studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
India does not have access to the bridge fuels such as natural gas like the West, and it will take longer for other alternates such as storage plus renewables to become affordable because of the sheer complexity of India's electricity sector.
India expert Nalima Jain says Modi will seek reassurances that the costs of transitioning away from fossil fuels will be offset by donations from wealthier nations. They have yet to meet their 2009 commitment to send $100 billion a year to assist poorer nations in climate mitigation.
India needs to be showcased as the guiding force for a lot of developing countries. What it does with its carbon emission today will possibly showcase what the developing world could do.
And Jane says that makes Prime Minister Modi the best messenger for the developing world at the Glasgow climate talks. In Washington, Jessica Stone for VOA News.
For more details about the upcoming COP26 summit, joining us now is Voice of America's correspondent Chris Casquejo from Washington. Chris, thanks so much for joining us. Now, U.S. President Joe Biden is traveling to the COP26 summit in a sign that the U.S. takes climate change seriously, but the White House has scaled back its climate change plan already. So what exactly is the Biden administration's strategy here?
Good morning from the White House. President Biden is proposing $555 billion to tackle climate change. The $555 billion would largely be spent on programs like tax incentives to move Americans out of gasoline-powered cars and into electric vehicles. That money would also go to utility companies to move them away from natural gas and coal and into clean energy alternatives like solar. The White House says its measures will cut greenhouse gas pollution by well over 1 gigaton in 2030, which would represent a 50 to 52% reduction in carbon emissions. But it's not clear whether the measure has enough votes to pass in the U.S. Senate. One of the holdouts has been Senator Joe Manchin, who represents West Virginia, a state whose economy is largely dependent on the coal industry. President Biden met with lawmakers hoping to have a deal in hand on a larger $1.75 trillion infrastructure package before he left for the 2 global summits, the meeting of G20 leaders and COP26. but lawmakers probably won't even hold a vote until next week.
Right, Chris, thanks for those inputs. Stay with us on this broadcast. We'll come back to you for your inputs on another story. More than 50,000 Afghan refugees who are now housed at U.S. military bases will be resettled through the United States in the coming few months. The largest number will be heading to California and Texas. Take a look at this next report from Voice of America's Mike O'Sullivan.
Afghan Americans in California protest what they call the Taliban government's repressive and cruel behavior during separate rallies in San Diego and Los Angeles in August and September. Now they're preparing for the arrival of Afghan refugees. One aid worker says the refugees are relieved to have fled a country led by the Taliban.
They're also very thankful that America was able to accept them, and then also that the AMEMSA community, the Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, South Asian community, worked really hard to pool resources to help these individuals find housing, to help pay for basic necessities.
One Afghan American who worked as an interpreter for U.S. forces resettled in the U.S. with a special immigrant visa in late 2012. He's helping to store supplies for newcomers, but also worries about Afghans left behind.
People are losing their lives. Taliban are searching. They are saying one thing but doing another thing.
Saadet says dozens of his family members are living in fear in Afghanistan, including a brother who once worked for U.S. forces. Millions of Afghans have fled war in the country over the last 40 years. The UN Refugee Agency says 90% of those refugees now live in Iran and Pakistan. Saadet says the U.S. and its allies must help those who helped them and pressure the Taliban to respect human rights.
The solution should be that how should we make sure that the Taliban has a good government, a very inclusive government that represents all of the race and ethnicities in Afghanistan, not just from one tribe, not just from one political party.
California will receive more than 5,000 Afghan refugees in the first group. Some communities are asking for federal help and for locals to step up too.
All these folks need placement, and it makes sense that they're placed with people that speak the same language that can help them immigrate.
Afghan Americans are not optimistic about the future of their homeland, but still hope for change.
We want to see an Afghanistan that is free, an Afghanistan that is peaceful, an Afghanistan that believes in human rights for all people.
In the meantime, tens of thousands of Afghan refugees will join others who have built a better life in America. Mike O'Sullivan, VOA News, Los Angeles.
We still have Voice of America's correspondent Chris Casquejo with us from Washington. Chris, thanks for staying on. Now, while the U.S. prepares to find Afghan refugees new homes, the situation in Afghanistan continues to deteriorate. What is the international community doing about the worsening crisis in Afghanistan as of now?
Priyanka, international aid agencies say more than half the country's population, a record 22.8 million people, face acute hunger in the coming months. That includes millions of children. Nearly 3/4 of the previous Afghan government's funding was supported by foreign money. That funding stopped when the Taliban took over. The United States has also frozen nearly $10 billion of Afghanistan's assets. But the U.S. has also announced $144 million in new humanitarian aid to Afghanistan. It has now pledged $474 million in aid to Afghanistan this year alone. This week, China urged the U.S. and Western nations to lift sanctions, but also called on the Taliban to effectively protect the rights of women. China has pledged an additional $6 million in humanitarian aid to Afghanistan, bringing its total commitment to $31 million.
Right, Chris Casquejo from VOA. Thank you so much for all your inputs, and thank you for joining us on this special broadcast on WION World is One.